Before Susanoo drew his sword, the 8-headed serpent had already devoured 7 daughters, but tonight, you'll discover the secret that saved the 8th. Good evening, sleepless historians. Welcome back to another journey through the mists of ancient legend, where tonight we venture into the heart of Japan to meet one of mythology's most terrifying creatures. I'm your guide through these quiet hours, and wherever you are in the world tonight, whether you're settling into bed in Tokyo or watching the stars from somewhere far away, I'm glad you've chosen to spend this time exploring the strange and beautiful darkness of old stories. Tonight's tale takes us to a time when gods walked among mortals, when storms had names and faces, when the line between the divine and the earthly was as thin as morning mist. We'll follow the storm god Susanoo in his exile, witness the terror of a creature so vast that mountains seem small beside it, and discover how love and cunning can triumph over even the most ancient evil. As always, I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight. Are you drifting off in a bustling city, or finding peace in countryside silence? Whatever brings you here, settle in, get comfortable, and let the gentle rhythm of this ancient story carry you towards sleep. The name itself sounds like wind through bamboo. Yamata-no-Orochi. 8 heads, 8 tails, a body so massive it could span 8 valleys and 8 hills. But before we meet this legendary beast, we must first understand the god who would face it, and the family whose tragedy would call him from the heavens to act. In the early days of the world, when the islands of Japan were still young, and the kami, the spirits of all things, moved freely between the realms of sky and earth, the cosmic order was delicate as morning dew on spider silk. The heavenly realm of Takamagahara stretched above the mortal world like a vast garden where immortal beings tended to the forces that shaped reality itself. Here, in palaces built from crystallized starlight and halls whose pillars were woven from solidified wind, lived the children of Izanagi and Izanami, the creator deities who had stirred the primordial ocean with a jeweled spear and brought forth the archipelago from the depths. Among these divine siblings, 3 stood above all others in power and responsibility. Amaterasu, the sun goddess, possessed beauty that could make flowers bloom in winter and wisdom that guided the seasons in their eternal dance. Her light was not merely illumination but life itself, carrying within its golden threads the warmth that coaxed rice from soil and hope from human hearts. When she smiled, clouds parted with joy. When she wept, her tears became the morning dew that blessed the earth with fertility. Her palace was a marvel of celestial architecture, with walls that were transparent like crystal but strong as diamond, allowing the divine light to flow freely throughout the heavenly realm. Gardens surrounded her dwelling where flowers bloomed in impossible colors, blues deeper than the midnight sky, reds more vibrant than rubies, golds that seemed to contain their own miniature suns. These gardens were tended by spirits of growth and renewal, beings whose very touch could bring dead earth back to life, whose songs could coax seeds to sprout even in the depths of winter. The sun goddess spent her days overseeing the careful balance of light and shadow that made life possible on the mortal realm below. She watched over farmers as they planted their rice, blessing their work with the exact amount of warmth needed for the grain to flourish. She guided the migration of birds, ensuring they would arrive at their destinations at precisely the right moments to maintain the delicate web of life that connected all living things. Tsukuyomi, the moon god, was her complement in balance, a figure of silver serenity who watched over the night hours with gentle vigilance. His domain was the realm of dreams and quiet contemplation, of lovers' whispered promises and scholars' midnight studies. Under his gaze the tides rose and fell in perfect rhythm, and pregnant women counted the days until their children would be born. His light was cooler than his sister's but no less essential, providing the peaceful darkness that allowed all living things to rest and restore themselves. Where Amaterasu's palace blazed with constant light, Tsukuyomi's dwelling was a place of soft shadows and reflected illumination. The walls were made of polished silver that caught and held the faintest glimmers of starlight, creating an atmosphere of profound tranquility. His gardens grew night-blooming flowers whose petals opened only in darkness, releasing fragrances that could soothe troubled minds and bring peaceful sleep to the restless. The moon god's responsibilities were as crucial as his sisters', though they operated in quieter, more subtle ways. He guided the dreams of mortals, weaving through their sleeping minds visions that could inspire, heal, or warn of dangers to come. He watched over night travelers, providing enough light to keep them safe on dark roads while maintaining the gentle darkness that allowed the natural world to rest. He presided over the delicate cycles of growth and decay that governed all life, ensuring that death would always be followed by renewal, that winter would always give way to spring. And then there was Susanoo, god of storms and wind and the wild chaos that existed at the edges of order. He was as magnificent as his siblings, possessed of a raw power that could split mountains and redirect rivers, but where they had learned to channel their divine strength into nurturing and protection, Susanoo remained untamed. His hair was black as storm clouds, his eyes flashed with the light of lightning, and when he moved the very air around him stirred with barely contained energy. Susanoo's palace in Takamagahara was unlike those of his siblings, built not from crystal or silver but from solidified storm clouds that shifted and roiled even while maintaining their basic structure. The walls were alive with constant motion, displaying ever-changing patterns of lightning and thunder that reflected the god's turbulent inner nature. When he was calm, the palace would settle into a gentle gray that was almost peaceful to behold. When his emotions ran high, the structure would blaze with electric fire and resound with the crash of thunder that could be heard throughout the heavenly realm. His gardens were equally dramatic, filled with plants that thrived on electrical energy and flowers that bloomed only during storms. Trees grew there whose leaves were made of condensed lightning, their branches swaying in winds that existed nowhere else in creation. Rain fell upward in some sections, defying the normal laws of nature, while in others, small tornadoes danced between the flower beds like playful spirits made of wind and motion. From childhood, if such a term could be applied to beings who had emerged fully formed from their father's purification rituals, Susanoo had been different from his siblings. Where Amaterasu delighted in the careful cultivation of growing things, studying the precise needs of each plant and creature under her care, Susanoo was fascinated by destruction and renewal, by the violent beauty of hurricanes and the sudden transformation that lightning could bring to a landscape. Where Tsukuyomi found peace in contemplation and stillness, in the quiet observation of the night world's gentle rhythms, Susanoo was always in motion, always seeking new challenges, new boundaries to test and overcome. His storms were indeed magnificent to behold, spiraling towers of wind and rain that could stretch from earth to heaven, phenomena so beautiful that even other gods would pause in their work to watch them dance across the sky. The youngest spirits in Takamagahara would gather at the edges of the heavenly realm to witness these displays, their eyes wide with wonder at the raw power and artistic beauty that Susanoo could command. His hurricanes painted abstract masterpieces across the sky, with clouds arranged in patterns that rivaled the finest calligraphy, lightning that traced geometric designs of impossible complexity. But beauty and destructiveness were not mutually exclusive in Susanoo's nature. His hurricanes leveled forests and scattered the roofs of temples like leaves in autumn wind. His lightning split ancient trees that had stood for centuries, trees that had witnessed the rise and fall of human civilizations, that had sheltered countless generations of birds and beasts. His floods turned carefully, tended rice fields into lakes of mud and disappointment, destroying in minutes the work of entire seasons, leaving farmers to face winter with empty storehouses and hungry children. The other inhabitants of Takamagahara grew increasingly weary of their storm brother's inability to moderate his power. Inari, the rice deity whose flowing robes were woven from golden grain, and whose crown was made of jade rice seedlings, wept to see harvests destroyed by unseasonable tempests. She would descend to the mortal realm after each of Susanoo's outbursts, working tirelessly to help farmers replant their ruined crops, blessing new seeds with divine vitality that might help them recover some portion of their losses. Hachiman, god of war and divine protector, found his own work complicated when Susanoo's storms disrupted military campaigns and scattered armies that had been months in the preparing. The war god's duty was to ensure that conflicts ended swiftly and decisively, that the violence necessary to maintain justice did not drag on indefinitely and cause unnecessary suffering. But when Susanoo's tempests struck battlefields, they made no distinction between righteous and unrighteous forces, scattering both sides equally and prolonging conflicts that should have ended quickly. Even Benzaiten, goddess of music and flowing water, whose songs could heal broken hearts and whose rivers brought life to the most barren lands, discovered that her work was constantly undermined by her storm brother's lack of control. Her carefully crafted river systems would become muddy torrents when Susanoo's rains fell too hard and too fast upon the mountains. The delicate ecosystems she had spent centuries nurturing would be disrupted by sudden floods or unexpected droughts when Susanoo's moods shifted without warning. But it was the incident with the weaving hall that finally exhausted their father's patience and led to the crisis that would change everything. Amaterasu had been hosting one of the most sacred ceremonies in the celestial calendar, gathering the celestial maiden spirits to weave the new garments that would clothe the coming season. These were not ordinary garments but magical vestments that carried within their threads the power to influence the weather, the growth of crops, the health of animals and the general prosperity of the mortal realm. The weaving hall itself was a marvel of divine craftsmanship, a structure that existed partially outside normal space and time, allowing the maiden spirits to work with threads that were spun from sunlight, moonbeams, and the essence of growing things. The looms were made from wood that had grown in the first garden at the center of creation, their mechanisms so perfectly calibrated that they could weave patterns of incredible complexity, while producing cloth of supernatural beauty and power. It was delicate work that required perfect concentration and harmonious cooperation. Each thread had to be placed with the precision of ritual and the intention of blessing. The maiden spirits would sing as they worked, their voices weaving together in harmonies that were themselves a form of magic, helping to imbue the cloth with the qualities it would need to fulfill its cosmic purpose. The finished garments would carry the power to bring gentle warmth to spring rice paddies, the exact amount of rainfall needed for the summer growing season, the cool breezes that would help autumn harvests ripen to perfection. The ceremony took place over the course of 7 days and 7 nights, during which time the participants could not be disturbed by any external influence. The slightest disruption could ruin weeks of careful preparation and leave the mortal world without the divine protection that the seasonal garments provided. The maiden spirits entered a state of deep meditation while they worked, their consciousness extending beyond their physical forms to touch the very essence of the seasons they were helping to create. Susanoo, perhaps feeling excluded from this important work, perhaps simply unable to contain his turbulent nature during such a prolonged period of required stillness and quiet, had chosen the most crucial moment of the ceremony to release a storm of particular intensity directly above the weaving hall. It was not malice that drove him but a combination of loneliness, restlessness, and the fundamental inability to understand why his siblings' work was considered more valuable than his own artistic expressions of divine power. The storm that erupted above the weaving hall was unlike any that Susanoo had ever created before. It seemed to channel all of his frustration and isolation into a single devastating display of meteorological fury. Hurricane winds strong enough to uproot mountains combined with hailstones the size of boulders, lightning that struck with the frequency of raindrops, and torrential rains that fell with such force that they carved new valleys in the landscape below. The building, though constructed with divine craftsmanship and protected by layers of celestial wards, could not withstand the combination of forces that Susanoo unleashed upon it. The roof, made from crystallized cloud matter that had been shaped by the hands of creation spirits, cracked and then shattered like glass under the assault. The walls, woven from light itself and strengthened with the songs of ancient powers, buckled and collapsed as winds that had never existed in the natural world tore through the sacred space. The looms, those miraculous instruments that had been used to weave the fate of seasons since the beginning of time, were destroyed in moments. Thousands of hours of careful work vanished as half-completed garments were torn to shreds by the wind or dissolved by rain that carried within it the essence of pure chaos. The threads that had been spun from sunlight and moonbeams unraveled and disappeared, their divine essence scattered to the 8 directions where it would take centuries to gather again. But the worst tragedy of the disaster was not the destruction of the hall or the loss of the sacred garments. One of the celestial maiden spirits, a being whose existence had been dedicated to the creation of beauty and the nurturing of life, was injured by falling debris when the roof collapsed. Her name was Waka Hirumi, and she was Amaterasu's favorite attendant, a spirit of such purity and grace that flowers would bloom in her footsteps and birds would sing more sweetly in her presence. The injury was not fatal. Celestial beings could not be killed by physical harm, but it was profound enough to send her into a deep healing sleep that would last for years. During this time, the particular gift she brought to the weaving would be lost, and the seasonal garments would lack the touch of perfect innocence that her participation provided. The ramifications would be felt throughout the mortal realm as springs came later, summers burned hotter, and winters lasted longer than they should have. The silence that followed this catastrophe was more terrible than any storm Susanoo had ever unleashed. When the winds died and the rain stopped falling, when the last echoes of thunder faded from the air, an absolute quiet settled over Takamagahara that seemed to stretch on for eternity. It was the silence of profound disappointment, of trust broken beyond easy repair, of harmony shattered by thoughtless violence. Amaterasu's face had gone pale as winter moonlight, and her eyes carried a disappointment so profound that flowers began to wilt in the gardens around Takamagahara. Her light, which had always been constant and warming, flickered and dimmed as she struggled to comprehend how her beloved brother could have caused such destruction. The injured maiden was tended by healing spirits, but the damage to the cosmic order was not so easily repaired. Without the new seasonal garments, the transition from winter to spring would be harsh and uncertain, causing suffering for millions of mortals who depended on the smooth progression of the seasons for their survival. Izanagi, the All-Father whose tears had become the seas and whose breath had become the winds, summoned Susanoo before the assembled council of heaven. The great deity's expression was not one of anger, which Susanoo could have understood and met with defiance, but of profound sadness mixed with the terrible weight of necessary judgment. The Creator God looked older than Susanoo had ever seen him, as if the burden of making such a decision was aging even his immortal frame. The council chamber was a space that existed at the very heart of Takamagahara, a circular room with walls that showed constantly shifting views of all the realms of existence. Here, the assembled gods could observe the effects of their decisions on every level of reality, from the movements of the smallest insects to the birth and death of stars. It was a place where truth could not be hidden, and where the full consequences of any action became immediately apparent to all who entered.
"My son," Izanagi said, his voice carrying the authority of creation itself, each word weighted with the power that had first spoken the universe into existence. "You possess power that could bless all the worlds, strength that could protect and nurture and inspire all of creation. But you have not learned to govern yourself. An ungoverned power becomes a curse rather than a gift. I cannot allow your storms to continue disrupting the harmony we have worked so long to establish." The decree of banishment fell like a mountain collapsing, each word creating tremors that ran through the foundations of heaven itself. Susanoo would be cast down from Takamagahara, stripped of his position in the celestial hierarchy, forbidden to return until he had learned to use his power in service of something greater than his own restless energy. The sentence was not eternal, the gods were not cruel, but it would last until Susanoo could demonstrate that he had truly changed, that he could channel his tremendous strength into protection rather than destruction. The punishment was designed not merely as retribution but as education. Izanagi understood that his son's nature was not inherently evil, but it had become unbalanced by isolation and lack of purpose. In the mortal realm, surrounded by beings whose lives could be easily destroyed by careless use of divine power, Susanoo would be forced to learn the restraint and compassion that had eluded him in the protective environment of heaven. But the most terrifying truth was yet to emerge from the serpent's lair. Cast down from heaven like a falling star, Susanoo's descent to the mortal realm was itself a spectacle that would be remembered in legend for generations. His divine form blazed across the sky like a meteor, trailing clouds of silver fire and leaving a wake of ionized air that crackled with residual power. Mortals across the length of Japan looked up from their evening meals and their twilight prayers to witness the strange new star that traced its burning path across the heavens before disappearing beyond the horizon. When he struck the earth, the impact created a crater that would later become a sacred lake, its waters always warm despite the coldest winters, always perfectly clear despite the muddiest seasons. The crater was perfectly circular, as if carved by divine geometry, and its walls were lined with a strange crystalline substance that had been formed by the intense heat of Susanoo's fall. Local villagers would name it Kami no Namida, the tears of the gods, and would make pilgrimages there for centuries to come, believing that the waters held healing properties. But the physical trauma of his fall was nothing compared to the spiritual anguish that settled upon him like a heavy cloak. For the first time in his existence, Susanoo experienced true loneliness, a isolation so complete that it seemed to echo in the very bones of the earth beneath his feet. In Takamagahara, even when the other gods disapproved of his actions, he had never doubted his place in the cosmic order. He was the storm god, essential and powerful, his very existence a necessary part of the great mechanism that kept the universe functioning. Now cast out and diminished, he wandered the mortal world carrying his exile like a stone in his chest. The sensation was entirely foreign to his divine nature. Gods were not meant to experience such profound disconnection from their purpose and their people. He found himself questioning everything he had once taken for granted, his role in creation, the value of his power, even his right to exist as he was. His divine power, once celebrated in the celestial court, now seemed like a curse that marked him wherever he went. Every step he took brought storms, but these were not the magnificent, purposeful tempests he had wielded in heaven. These were sad, aimless weather, gray drizzles that lasted for weeks, sudden gusts that knocked over market stalls and scattered children's toys, lightning that struck randomly, and without the artistic precision he had once taken pride in. The mortals fled from him not because they recognized his divine nature, but because his presence brought nothing but discomfort and inconvenience. Farmers would abandon their fields when the strange weather patterns announced his approach. Merchants would pack up their wares and seek shelter until the unnatural storms passed. Children would be hurried indoors by parents who sensed something unnatural in the wind, something that made their skin crawl and their hearts race with nameless anxiety. He walked alone through empty villages and silent forests, past rice fields that turned to mud under his inadvertent influence and fishing boats that stayed safely harbored rather than risk the unpredictable weather that followed in his wake. The very animals seemed to sense something wrong about him. Birds would not sing when he approached, cats would disappear into hiding, and even the hardy mountain deer would bound away rather than graze peacefully in his vicinity. Dogs would whimper and press themselves against their owner's legs when he passed by unseen. Horses would refuse to travel roads that he had recently walked, no matter how their riders urged them forward. Even insects seemed affected by his presence. Bees would abandon their hives, butterflies would alter their migration patterns, and the busy ants that normally ignored everything in their focused pursuit of food would suddenly scatter in all directions as if fleeing an invisible threat. For months Susanoo wandered the length and breadth of the Japanese islands, learning intimate lessons about solitude and regret that no amount of divine wisdom could have taught him while he remained in heaven. He discovered that divine power without purpose was not strength but burden, that the ability to change the world meant nothing if those changes brought only harm. He learned that true power was not measured by the magnitude of destruction one could unleash, but by the restraint one could exercise in the face of provocation. In quiet moments, sitting beside streams that grew turbulent at his approach, or resting under trees that shed their leaves in unseasonable response to his mood, he began to understand what his father had been trying to teach him. The mortal world operated on principles he had never bothered to observe while living in celestial comfort. Here, every action had consequences that rippled outward like stones thrown into still ponds, creating patterns of cause and effect that could persist for generations. A farmer's entire livelihood could be destroyed by a single misplaced storm, leaving entire families to face starvation during the long winter months. A fishing village could face economic collapse if the weather kept boats in harbor for too long, disrupting not only the immediate catch, but the complex web of trade relationships that sustained the community. Children could go hungry if the rains came too early or too late for the rice crops, their young bodies suffering from malnutrition that would affect their growth and development for years to come. His power, which had seemed like pure expression of divine will in heaven, became a responsibility of staggering weight when he saw its effects on fragile mortal lives. Each unconscious gesture that brought wind or rain now carried with it the potential for tragedy on a scale that he had never bothered to consider. The realization was humbling in a way that no amount of criticism from his fellow gods had ever been. During his wandering, he encountered many who suffered from circumstances beyond their control, families displaced by floods not of his making, villages struggling to recover from natural disasters, old people facing their final winters with insufficient food stored away. Gradually, almost without realizing it, he began to moderate his unconscious influence on the weather around these people. It started with small gestures, barely noticeable adjustments to the atmospheric conditions in his immediate vicinity. A small effort to pull rain clouds away from a village celebrating a harvest festival, allowing the families to enjoy their feast under clear skies. A gentle warming of the air around travelers caught in an unexpected cold snap, preventing frostbite and hypothermia. A shift in wind patterns that helped fishing boats return safely to harbor when a sudden squall threatened to dash them against the rocks. These tiny acts of consideration were the first steps on a path he didn't yet recognize he was walking. Each small kindness taught him something new about the delicate balance that governed mortal existence, about the profound impact that even minor divine interventions could have on human lives. He began to understand that true power lay not in the ability to reshape the world according to one's will, but in the wisdom to know when intervention was needed, and when it was better to let natural processes unfold without interference. It was during these dark wanderings, when he had begun to learn the difference between power and wisdom, between strength and purpose, that he came upon a sound that pierced even his divine indifference, the sound of weeping that seemed to rise from the very earth itself. The crying was not like ordinary human grief, which he had heard many times during his exile. This was something deeper, more primal, a lamentation that seemed to echo with the sorrow of the world itself. Following the voices through a grove of ancient cedars whose bark was scarred by centuries of wind and weather, Susanoo found himself in a clearing that seemed to exist outside the normal flow of time. The trees formed a perfect circle around a space of moss-covered earth, their branches intertwining overhead to create a natural cathedral that filtered the late afternoon light into patterns of gold and green. The trees themselves were ancient beyond measure, their trunks so massive that it would take a dozen men holding hands to encircle them. Their bark bore the scars of countless storms, the marks of lightning strikes, the smooth patches where lovers had carved their names centuries ago. These were the kind of trees that had witnessed the rise and fall of kingdoms, that had sheltered refugees from forgotten wars, that had stood as silent sentinels while the human world changed around them. In the center of this sacred space sat three figures whose grief was so profound it seemed to weigh down the very air around them. Ethereal light filtered through the canopy above, but even this natural illumination appeared dimmed by the sorrow that emanated from the little group like heat from dying coals. The moss beneath them glowed with a soft phosphorescence that spoke of deep magic, and tiny spirits of light danced among the ferns that carpeted the forest floor. The old man's name was Ashinazuchi, and his wife was called Tenazuchi. Even in their distress, Susanoo could sense the quiet dignity that marked them as more than ordinary mortals. They were earthly kami, spirits of the fields and harvest, beings who had dedicated their existence to the patient work of nurturing life from soil and season. Their hands bore the stains of honest labor, earth under the fingernails, calluses from handling tools, the weathered skin that came from spending countless hours under sun and rain helping crops grow and flourish. Ashinazuchi's hair was white as snow but thick and full, pulled back in a simple style that spoke of practical concerns rather than vanity. His clothing was woven from fibers that seemed to shift color depending on the angle of the light, browns and greens that echoed the fertile earth he had spent his existence tending. His face was lined with age and care, but the lines spoke of laughter as much as sorrow, of seasons of joy that had preceded this time of overwhelming grief. Tenazuchi was smaller and more delicate than her husband, but there was a strength in her bearing that spoke of inner resilience developed over centuries of patient service. Her hair was the color of autumn leaves, red and gold braided together in complex patterns that seemed to move with a life of their own. Her clothing was simpler than her husband's but no less beautiful, dyed in shades of green that matched the young plants she had helped to grow throughout her long existence. The girl was their daughter, Kusanagi, and the moment Susanoo's eyes fell upon her, he felt something shift inside his chest like the first movement of spring after endless winter. She had not always been their only child, he learned through their broken explanations. Once they told him, they had 8 daughters, each more beautiful than spring flowers, each more precious than the morning dew that blessed the rice paddies. But she had not always been their only child. The words fell between them like stones into still water, creating ripples of meaning that expanded outward to encompass years of loss and grief. Once they told Susanoo, they had 8 daughters, each more beautiful than spring flowers, each more precious than the morning dew. Kusanagi herself was a vision that seemed to encapsulate all the beauty her lost sisters had possessed. Her hair was black as a moonless night, but shot through with threads of silver that caught the light like stars. Her skin had the pale luminescence of pearls, and her eyes were the deep brown of rich earth after rain. She wore robes of silk that seemed to have been woven from mist and moonlight, garments that shifted and flowed around her like living things. But it was more than her physical beauty that captured Susanoo's attention. There was something in her bearing, a quality of serene acceptance that spoke of wisdom far beyond her apparent years. While her parents wept with the accumulated grief of 7 losses, she sat straight and composed, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze fixed on some distant point beyond the circle of trees. The eldest daughter, Kusanagi, had possessed a voice so pure that when she sang, cherry trees would bloom out of season and birds would gather from miles around to listen. Her songs had the power to ease the pain of childbirth and bring peaceful sleep to feverish children. She had been gifted with the ability to heal through music, her melodies carrying within them the essence of life itself. Her voice had been known throughout the region, and people would travel for days to hear her sing during festivals and ceremonies. Mothers would bring sick children to listen to her lullabies, and the elderly would request her presence during their final days, finding comfort in songs that seemed to bridge the gap between life and death. She had been taken first, 7 years ago, when the family still believed that perhaps some bargain could be struck with the monster, some offering that might satisfy its hunger without requiring such a terrible sacrifice. The second daughter, Kusanagi, had been gifted with hands that could weave dreams into silk, creating fabrics that brought good fortune to whoever wore them. Her tapestries told stories that seemed to move and breathe, depicting scenes so lifelike that viewers would swear they could hear the conversations of the figures embroidered upon them. When she disappeared into the serpent's maw, the local textile industry had never quite recovered its former artistry. She had worked with looms that seemed to exist partially in the spirit world, able to weave threads that were spun from moonlight and morning mist. Her creations were not merely beautiful but were imbued with protective qualities that could shield their wearers from misfortune and harm. Brides throughout the province had treasured wedding garments created by her hands, knowing that marriages blessed by her work would be happy and prosperous. Kusanagi, the third to be taken, could speak with birds, and knew the language of wind through leaves. Farmers would consult her about weather patterns, and her predictions were so accurate that entire provinces would adjust their planting schedules based on her advice. She could call specific birds to carry messages faster than any human messenger, and during droughts, she could convince the rain spirits to show mercy on the suffering crops. Her gift had extended beyond simple communication with animals to a deeper understanding of the natural world's rhythms and patterns. She could read the future in the flight of birds, predict earthquakes by listening to the songs of insects, and forecast the severity of coming winters by observing the behavior of forest creatures. Her loss had left farmers throughout the region vulnerable to the unpredictable forces of nature. The fourth daughter, Kusanagi, had been a healer, whose touch could cure ailments that baffled the most learned physicians. She worked particularly with children and animals, beings whose natural innocence allowed them to benefit most fully from her gift. Her garden had been filled with medicinal herbs that grew with supernatural vigor under her care, and people would travel for days to seek her help for their sick loved ones. She had possessed the rare ability to see directly into the spiritual causes of physical illness, understanding that many diseases originated not in the body but in disturbances of the soul or spirit. Her treatments had addressed not only the symptoms of illness but their deeper sources, often involving complex rituals that restored harmony between the patient and the natural world. Kusanagi, the fifth daughter, possessed the ability to see the future in pools of still water. Her prophecies were always gentle. She focused on predicting good harvests, successful journeys, and happy marriages rather than dwelling on the darker possibilities that swirled through time's currents. Young lovers would seek her blessing, and her approval was considered essential for any major undertaking in the region.
Her visions had been remarkably accurate, but she had used her gift with great wisdom, understanding that knowledge of the future could be as much curse as blessing. She would reveal only what people needed to know to make wise decisions, carefully avoiding prophecies that might cause despair or lead to the very tragedies she foresaw. The sixth daughter, Kusanagi, had been blessed with a supernatural understanding of growing things. Under her guidance, barren fields would flourish, fruit trees would bear double their normal yield, and gardens would produce vegetables of extraordinary size and flavor. She could sense the health of plants from great distances, and had saved countless crops from disease and pest infestations through her timely interventions. Her connection to the plant kingdom had been so profound that she could actually communicate with the spirits that inhabited trees, flowers, and grain. Through these conversations, she had learned secrets of cultivation that had been passed down through generations of plant spirits, knowledge that allowed her to coax abundance from even the poorest soil. Kusanagi, the seventh and most recently taken, had possessed the rare gift of being able to calm wild animals and gain their cooperation. Bears would lumber down from the mountains to help with heavy labor when she requested it. Wolves would guard the village flocks against other predators. Even dangerous creatures like wild boars and venomous snakes would become docile in her presence, allowing her to relocate them safely when they wandered too close to populated areas. Her gift had extended to the most dangerous creatures, beings that normally could not be approached by humans without risk of death. She had once convinced a family of mountain tigers to help search for a lost child, and the great cats had worked alongside human volunteers until the boy was found safe. Her death had left the region more vulnerable to animal attacks, and had disrupted the delicate balance between human communities and the wild creatures that shared their land. Every year, the old man said, his voice breaking like autumn leaves, his hands trembling as he spoke of losses that had carved holes in his heart, a monster comes from the deep valleys. A serpent with 8 heads and 8 tails, eyes like winter berries, a body so vast it stretches across the horizon, and every year it demands one of our daughters. The pattern had been established 7 years ago, when the serpent had first emerged from the deepest valleys where no human had ever walked. Its initial appearance had been preceded by omens that should have warned of the disaster to come, springs that ran red with iron, birds that flew in patterns that hurt the eyes to follow, a quality in the air that made people nervous without being able to explain why. 7 times the monster had come, arriving always at the same season when the boundary between autumn and winter made the world uncertain and strange. 7 times a daughter had been taken, each loss tearing another piece from the parents' souls until they seemed like shadows of their former selves. 7 times the earth itself had seemed to weep with the parents' grief, producing crops that were smaller and less nourishing, as if the very land shared in their sorrow. The serpent's hunger seemed to be focused specifically on this family, though none could understand why they had been chosen for such torment. Other families in the region had daughters of equal beauty and virtue. Other households possessed treasures and powers that might have attracted the creature's attention. Yet year after year, Yamata-no-Orochi returned to this single dwelling, as if drawn by some cosmic compulsion that transcended mere appetite. Now only Kusanagi remained, and the time of the serpent's return was drawing near with the inexorable certainty of sunrise or tide. The signs were already becoming apparent to those who knew how to read them: unusual behavior in wild animals, strange colors in the sunset, a quality in the wind that made even brave warriors shiver and look over their shoulders. The very air seemed to grow heavier with each passing day, as if the atmosphere itself was preparing for the arrival of something that did not belong in the natural world. Susanoo looked at the girl, truly looked at her, and saw something that made his storm-tossed heart grow still for the first time since his banishment. She was beautiful, yes, but more than that, she was brave in a way that reminded him of mountains standing calm in the face of hurricanes. While her parents wept with the accumulated grief of 7 losses, she sat straight and composed, watching the horizon as if she could face whatever came from it with eyes wide open and spirit unbroken. There was no fear in her expression, only a quiet strength that reminded him of moonlight on still water, of the deep peace that existed at the center of the most violent storms. In her calmness, he saw reflected all the virtues he had failed to cultivate in himself: patience instead of impetuosity, acceptance instead of rage, wisdom instead of mere power. She was everything he had never learned to be, and in that moment he understood why his father had sent him into exile. But there was something else in her manner that struck him even more profoundly. Despite the terrible fate that awaited her, despite watching 7 sisters disappear into the maw of an unspeakable monster, Kusanagi carried herself with a dignity that seemed to transform the very air around her. She was not merely accepting her fate, she was choosing to meet it with grace, and that choice elevated her from victim to something approaching the heroic. Her composure spoke of a philosophy that Susanoo had never encountered before, a way of understanding existence that transcended the simple categories of triumph and defeat that had governed his thinking throughout his divine existence. Here was someone who had found meaning not in victory but in the manner of facing whatever challenges life presented, who had discovered that courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision to act rightly, despite fear's presence. "Tell me about this serpent," Susanoo said, and his voice carried the authority of thunder, but thunder that had learned to speak softly. The words seemed to hang in the air between them, heavy with the weight of divine attention focused on mortal suffering. The old man's description painted a picture of nightmare made flesh, a creature so ancient and terrible that it seemed to exist outside the normal laws that governed the world. Yamata-no-Orochi was not merely a large snake or even a supernatural predator. It was a fragment of the primordial chaos that had existed before the gods brought order to creation, a living embodiment of the destructive forces that still lurked at the edges of civilized reality. Its 8 heads were not simply redundant features but represented the creature's mastery over multiple aspects of destruction. One head could breathe poison that withered crops for miles around, creating wastelands where nothing would grow for generations. Another could roar with such force that avalanches began in distant mountains, toppling peaks that had stood since the world's youth. A third could hypnotize victims with eyes that reflected their deepest fears, trapping them in waking nightmares from which there was no escape. The 4th head possessed teeth that could chew through solid stone as easily as a human might bite through soft fruit, capable of reducing ancient fortresses to rubble in minutes.
The fifth head secreted an acid so potent that it could dissolve metal and wood and bone with equal efficiency, leaving behind only puddles of noxious liquid that poisoned the earth for decades. The sixth head could see across vast distances and through solid obstacles, making it impossible for any creature to hide from the serpent's attention once it had chosen them as prey. The seventh head was said to possess the power of prophecy, able to foresee the strategies its enemies might employ and counter them before they could be implemented. This gift made the creature nearly impossible to defeat through conventional means, as it could anticipate attacks and position itself to neutralize them with minimal effort. The eighth head, the largest and most terrible of all, served as the creature's primary consciousness, coordinating the actions of its seven siblings with an intelligence that was both ancient and utterly alien. The serpent's 8 tails were equally fearsome, each one capable of independent action, each one serving a different purpose in the creature's campaign of terror. Some functioned as additional limbs for grasping and crushing, strong enough to wrap around entire buildings and reduce them to splinters. Others could burrow through earth and solid rock to create sinkholes and earthquakes, destabilizing the very foundations of the landscape. Still others secreted various toxins and corrosive substances, turning the creature's every movement into an environmental disaster. The creature's body was so massive that it defied easy comprehension. Its length was measured not in feet or yards but in valleys and mountain ranges. When it moved across the landscape, it carved new rivers and reshaped hills with its passage. Its scales were each the size of warriors' shields, harder than the finest steel and colored with patterns that seemed to shift and change depending on the angle of observation. Moss and small trees grew on its back, creating a mobile ecosystem that traveled wherever the monster went. But perhaps most terrifying of all was the creature's intelligence. This was not a mindless beast driven by simple hunger, but an ancient entity that planned and plotted, and seemed to take genuine pleasure in the psychological torment it inflicted upon its victims and their families. It did not simply kill and devour, it made its intentions known well in advance, allowing fear to build and spread, savoring the anticipation and dread that preceded each taking. The pattern was always the same, refined through 7 repetitions into a ritual of exquisite cruelty. First would come the signs, strange tremors in the earth that followed no recognizable seismic pattern, unusual behavior in wild animals who would flee the region en masse, a quality in the air that made people nervous without being able to explain why. The very insects would fall silent, and the wind would begin to blow in directions that defied the normal weather patterns. Then the creature would announce its presence with a roar that could be heard for dozens of miles, a sound that seemed to emanate not just from its throats but from the very ground beneath people's feet. The roar was unlike any natural sound. It contained overtones that resonated in human bones, harmonics that induced terror on a level deeper than conscious thought. Those who heard it would be afflicted with nightmares for weeks afterward, and many would never again feel completely safe in their own homes. On the appointed night, always the night of the new moon when darkness was complete and deep, Yamata-no-Orochi would emerge from its lair in the deepest valleys where no human had ever walked. These valleys existed in a twilight realm between the mortal world and the primordial chaos from which all monsters sprang. Places where the normal laws of nature held only tenuous sway, and where creatures from earlier epochs of creation could still survive. Its approach could be tracked by the devastation it left in its wake. Forests flattened as if by hurricanes, rivers changed in their courses or dried up entirely, hillsides scarred by the passage of its immense bulk. The creature seemed to take pleasure in destruction for its own sake, going out of its way to demolish anything beautiful or carefully constructed that lay along its path. Ancient shrines that had stood for centuries would be reduced to rubble, and gardens that had been tended for generations would be trampled into muddy ruin. When it reached the family's home, it would coil around the entire dwelling like a living fence, its 8 heads arranged so that escape in any direction became impossible. The sight was paralyzing in its alien geometry, 8 serpentine necks weaving through the air like a deadly dance, 8 pairs of eyes burning with malevolent intelligence, 8 mouths capable of swallowing a human being whole without effort. Then with deliberate slowness, it would begin to speak. Its voice was said to be like the sound of landslides mixed with the whisper of wind through tomb chambers, a sound that seemed to bypass the ears entirely and resonate directly in the listener's bones. The words it spoke were always the same, a recitation of the names of all the daughters it had already taken, followed by the name of the daughter it had come to claim. The recitation served multiple purposes. It demonstrated the creature's perfect memory and its methodical nature. It reminded the family of all they had already lost, and it made clear that resistance was futile. The serpent would speak each name with a lingering relish, as if savoring the memory of past conquests, and would describe in detail the unique gifts and qualities that had made each daughter precious. The creature would offer no bargain, accept no substitution, entertain no plea for mercy. It would simply wait, with the patience of geological time, until the designated daughter emerged to meet her fate. The waiting was perhaps the cruelest part of the ritual, as hope would build in the hearts of the family that perhaps this time would be different, that perhaps some miracle would intervene to save their child. And then, with a swiftness that seemed impossible for something so large, it would strike, and another bright life would vanish into the ancient darkness of its hunger. The taking was always swift. The creature seemed to derive its pleasure from the anticipation rather than the act itself. One moment the daughter would be standing in the doorway, gathering her courage for the final goodbye, and the next she would be gone, disappearing into one of the serpent's 8 mouths without even a cry of fear or pain. Yamata-no-Orochi was ancient beyond memory, a creature from the time before time, when chaos ruled the earth, and the very concepts of mercy and justice had not yet been born. Its 8 heads could swallow mountains, its 8 tails could level forests. Moss grew on its back like a verdant landscape, and its belly was always bloody, as if it had been feeding eternally on the life force of the world itself. When it moved, the earth shook with tremors that could be felt for hundreds of miles. When it roared, avalanches began in distant peaks, and even the bravest warriors would find their hands shaking, and their weapons suddenly feeling inadequate and small. The creature's origins were lost in the mists of creation, but ancient legends suggested that it was one of the primordial beings that had existed before the gods established order in the universe. Some said it was born from the tears of the earth itself during the first great cataclysm that had nearly destroyed all life. Others claimed it was the shadow cast by the sun during the first eclipse, given form and malevolent consciousness by forces that predated morality itself. What was certain was that Yamata-no-Orochi represented something fundamental and terrifying about the nature of existence, the knowledge that beneath the thin veneer of civilization and order lay forces of destruction that could not be reasoned with, bargained with, or appeased. It was chaos made manifest, a reminder that the universe was not inherently friendly to life, and that the peace and beauty that mortals treasured existed only through constant vigilance and the protection of powers greater than themselves. And in that moment, the storm god made a choice that would echo through eternity. "I will face this creature," Susanoo declared, and for the first time since his exile, his voice carried the full weight of divine purpose. But his words were not spoken in the thunderous tones of his former celestial arrogance. Instead, they carried a quiet certainty that seemed to emanate from some deeper source of strength he had discovered during his wandering. The very air around him grew still, as if the universe itself was listening to a fundamental shift in the cosmic order. The family looked at him with a mixture of hope and disbelief. Here was a stranger who claimed he could face a monster that had terrorized the land for 8 long years, a being so ancient and powerful that even the greatest warriors of the realm had fled rather than confront it. Yet there was something in Susanoo's bearing that made his promise feel possible, a quality of controlled power that suggested forces beyond mortal comprehension. His presence in the clearing had already begun to affect the natural world around them. The moss beneath his feet glowed more brightly, responding to the divine energy that radiated from his form. The ancient trees that ringed the clearing seemed to lean inward, as if trying to catch his words and carry them to other spirits throughout the forest. Even the small creatures that normally hid during the day, The fireflies and night moths, the tiny tree spirits and flower fairies, emerged from their hiding places to witness this unprecedented moment. But I ask for one thing in return, Susanoo continued, his eyes fixed on Kusanagi with an intensity that seemed to see through to her very soul. Give me your daughter's hand in marriage.
The request surprised them all, perhaps even Susanoo himself. The words seemed to emerge from some deep part of his consciousness that he had not known existed, a recognition that transcended rational thought. He was a god in exile, a storm prince cast down from heaven, a being of destruction and chaos who had wandered the earth, leaving only disruption in his wake. What could he offer a mortal woman? What kind of life could such a marriage bring? The vast difference in their natures seemed to make the proposal impossible. She was gentle where he was fierce, mortal where he was eternal, rooted in the peaceful cycles of earth, and seasoned where he belonged to the wild realms of sky and tempest. Yet something about her presence had awakened in him a possibility he had never considered, that his power could be channeled not toward conquest or domination, but toward protection and nurture. Her parents exchanged glances filled with complex emotions. They had already lost 7 daughters to the monster's hunger, and now they faced the possibility of losing their 8th and final child to marriage with a being whose true nature they could only guess at. Yet there was something in Susanoo's manner that spoke of honor and genuine affection rather than simple desire for possession. But Kusanagi looked at him with those calm, fearless eyes that had first captured his attention, and something passed between them that transcended the ordinary boundaries of divine and mortal, storm god and earth spirit. She saw past his exile and his shame to the potential for nobility that lay dormant within his wounded heart. He saw past her mortality to a strength of spirit that rivaled anything in the heavenly realm. In that exchange of glances, both of them recognized something that neither had expected: to find a perfect complement to their own nature. Where he was storm, she was the calm center around which storms could safely revolve. Where she was gentle, he was the fierce protection that could keep gentleness safe from those who would destroy it. Where he was eternal, she was the precious temporality that gave meaning to eternal existence. "If you can save my life," she said quietly, her voice carrying a dignity that transformed the clearing around them, "then my life is yours to share." The words were simple, but they carried within them layers of meaning that resonated through the spiritual realm like ripples in a still pond. This was not merely an agreement to a bargain, but a recognition of destiny, an acknowledgement that their meeting was not accidental but part of some larger pattern that governed the universe itself. Susanoo felt something shift inside his chest, something like the first ray of sunlight after an endless storm. Here was someone who did not flee from his presence, who looked at him and saw not a god or a monster, but simply a man who had offered to help. For the first time since his banishment, he felt worthy of something greater than his own anger and self-pity. The sensation was entirely new to his divine nature. Gods were accustomed to worship and fear, to reverence and awe, but not to simple human acceptance offered freely and without conditions. In Kusanagi-him's quiet agreement, he found something more valuable than all the ceremonies and sacrifices that had been offered to him in heaven: the gift of being seen and accepted for what he truly was, flaws and potential alike. But facing Yamata-no-Orochi would require more than divine strength or good intentions. It would require cunning, patience, and a plan as carefully crafted as the finest poetry. The serpent had survived since the dawn of time precisely because it was not merely a creature of brute force, but an entity of supernatural intelligence that had learned to anticipate and counter every strategy its enemies might devise. Previous heroes who had attempted to face the monster had relied on conventional approaches: sharp swords, strong armor, brave hearts, and righteous anger. All had failed because they had underestimated the creature's intelligence and overestimated the value of direct confrontation. Yamata-no-Orochi had seen every heroic strategy 1,000 times before and had developed counters for each one. Susanoo spent the following days walking the valleys where the serpent was said to dwell, studying the lay of the land with the careful attention of a military strategist preparing for the most important battle of his existence. He observed the patterns of wind and water,
noting how the air currents moved through the mountain passes and where the ground was most stable. He examined the remnants of previous encounters, broken weapons, scattered armor, the bones of heroes who had come before him with the same determination but inadequate preparation. He listened to the stories that older spirits whispered in the rustling of leaves and the murmur of streams, gathering fragments of ancient knowledge about the creature's habits and weaknesses. Tree spirits who had witnessed previous battles shared their observations about the monster's behavior patterns. River spirits described how the creature's movements affected water flow and erosion. Mountain spirits provided intelligence about the geological effects of the serpent's passage. From these investigations, he learned that Yamata-no-Orochi was indeed a being of vast power and cunning, but like all ancient creatures, it had developed certain predictable patterns over the centuries. It preferred to hunt during the new moon, when darkness was complete, and its massive form could move unseen until the moment of attack. It always approached from the same direction, following valleys and natural pathways that could accommodate its enormous bulk without getting trapped or constrained. Most importantly, it had developed over the millennia a particular weakness that might be exploited by someone clever enough to recognize the opportunity and patient enough to wait for the right moment to act. The creature's great intelligence was also its vulnerability. It had become so accustomed to victory through superior planning that it might be vulnerable to strategies that appeared to play into its expectations while actually serving a different purpose entirely. The serpent, despite its vast intelligence and supernatural power, had retained certain primitive appetites from its earliest days of existence. Chief among these was an almost obsessive love of sake, the rice wine that mortals brewed for celebrations and ceremonies. The stronger and more perfectly crafted the sake, the more irresistible it became to the great beast. This was not mere gluttony but something deeper, a connection to the earth's fertility, and the careful human craft that transformed simple rice into something approaching the divine. In the creature's earliest days, before it had become corrupted by eons of solitude and predation, it had been a guardian spirit of agricultural abundance, blessing harvests and ensuring that the delicate balance between wild nature and human cultivation remained stable. The transformation into a monster had not entirely eliminated these original instincts. Deep within its malevolent consciousness, Yamata-no-Orochi still retained an appreciation for the artistry and spiritual significance of sake brewing. The finest rice wines could awaken memories of its ancient purpose, creating moments of vulnerability when its guard might be lowered and its legendary caution temporarily suspended. In ancient times, before the serpent had become a terror that demanded the sacrifice of innocent lives, it had been known to accept offerings of particularly fine sake in exchange for controlling floods and ensuring good harvests. The relationship had soured over the centuries as human populations grew, and the old treaties between mortals and primordial spirits were forgotten, but the creature's fundamental nature remained unchanged. You haven't heard the darkest part of Yamata-no-Orochi's hunger yet. Susanoo returned to Ashinazuchi and Tenazuchi with his plan, explaining in careful detail what would be required to turn the serpent's ancient appetite against itself. They would need to brew 8 huge barrels of the strongest sake ever made, sake so potent that even a god would feel its effects, so perfectly crafted that no creature born of earth and rice could resist its call. They would need to build a fence with 8 openings, each opening just large enough for one of the serpent's heads but positioned to channel the creature's approach exactly where Susanoo wanted it. And they would need to wait with perfect patience for the monster to come, trusting that thousands of years of habit would make it vulnerable to a trap carefully tailored to its nature. The plan required not only courage but also faith that ancient patterns could be disrupted, that even the most powerful monsters had weaknesses that could be exploited, that love and determination could triumph over primordial evil. The brewing took weeks of intense labor, during which the entire family worked together with a dedication that transcended their individual fears and sorrows. Day and night, they tended the fermenting rice, adjusting temperatures with the precision of master craftsmen, testing for the perfect balance of alcohol and flavor, crafting not just a beverage but a work of art that would be worthy of the gods themselves. The process was more complex than ordinary sake brewing, requiring knowledge of ancient techniques that had been passed down through generations of master brewers and agricultural spirits. They used rice that had been blessed by earth kami, water from springs that had never been touched by pollution, and fermentation methods that incorporated elements of spiritual practice as well as physical craft. Susanoo lent his divine strength to the labor while learning the ancient art of sake making from mortals who had perfected it over generations. The work required a delicate touch that was foreign to his nature, no storms or lightning or dramatic gestures, but patient attention to detail, careful monitoring of tiny changes in temperature and fermentation, the kind of precise craft that his destructive tendencies had never allowed him to appreciate. Each step of the process taught him something new about the relationship between power and restraint, between force and finesse. He learned that the strongest sake was not produced through violent fermentation but through gentle encouragement of natural processes. He discovered that the most beautiful flavors emerged not from dramatic interventions but from patient waiting and careful observation. As they worked, he found himself watching Kusanagi with growing wonder and understanding. She moved through each task with graceful efficiency, never complaining about the danger they all faced, never questioning the strange plan that their survival depended upon. Her hands were skilled at every aspect of the process, from selecting the finest rice grains to adjusting the wooden machinery that ground them into powder, from maintaining the exact temperature needed for optimal fermentation to testing the developing sake with a palate refined through years of practice. But it was more than her technical skill that impressed him. It was the way she approached each element of the work as if it were a sacred ritual, bringing to even the most mundane tasks a quality of mindful attention that transformed simple labor into something approaching prayer. She understood, in a way that he was only beginning to learn, that the physical world was not separate from the spiritual but was instead the place where spiritual truths could be expressed through careful, loving action. Her movements had a rhythm that seemed to harmonize with the natural cycles of growth and decay that governed all life. When she stirred the fermenting rice, she did so with a patience that matched the slow transformation taking place within the vats. When she tested the developing alcohol, she brought to the task not just her trained palate, but a spiritual sensitivity that could detect qualities invisible to ordinary senses. In the evenings, as they waited for the rice to ferment and the sake to mature, developing the complex flavors that would make it irresistible to their ancient enemy, Kusanagi would tell Susanoo stories of her sisters. Each had been different, each had brought her own unique gift to the family and the community around them. And through these tales, he began to understand the magnitude of the loss that Yamata-no-Orochi had inflicted, not just on this one family but on the entire region. The eldest sister's songs had done more than simply please the ear. They had carried healing power that could ease the suffering of body and spirit alike. Her voice had been a bridge between the mortal and divine realms, capable of calling down blessings from the heavenly kami and drawing forth the hidden vitality that lay dormant in soil and seed. When she sang during planting season, crops would grow with unusual vigor. When she sang during times of illness, fever would break and pain would fade. Her loss had left a silence in the world that no ordinary music could fill. The second sister's weaving had been similarly touched with supernatural grace. Her textiles were not merely beautiful but were imbued with protective qualities that could shield their wearers from misfortune and harm. Brides would seek her wedding garments, knowing that cloth woven by her hands would bring happiness and fertility to their marriages. Warriors would commission battle clothes from her, trusting that her work would turn aside arrows and blades. Merchants would carry her fabrics to distant lands, where they would be treasured as much for their magical properties as for their artistic beauty. Each story revealed another layer of the tragedy that had befallen this family and the wider community. The sisters had not been simply beautiful young women, but pillars of their society, each contributing essential services that maintained the delicate balance between human civilization and the natural world. Their loss had created gaps in the social and spiritual fabric that could not easily be repaired. "Were you not afraid?" Susanoo asked one night, as they sat beside the bubbling vats of fermenting rice, the air around them rich with the sweet, complex aromas of developing sake, knowing that you might be next, watching each sister disappear, and knowing that your turn would eventually come. Kusanagi was quiet for a long moment, her hands still and thoughtful in her lap, her eyes fixed on the patterns of moonlight that filtered through the bamboo screens surrounding their workspace. When she finally spoke, her words carried a wisdom that humbled his divine knowledge and made him understand why the mortals his father had created were precious enough to be worth the trouble of governing and protecting. "Fear would not bring them back," she said finally, her voice soft but filled with a certainty that seemed to come from some deep well of inner strength. "Fear would not protect me from what was coming. Fear would only steal away the time I had left to love my parents, to see the sunrise paint the mountains gold, to feel grateful for the life I've been given. I chose to use my remaining days for joy rather than terror, for purpose rather than despair." Her answer revealed a kind of courage that made his storm strength seem small and crude by comparison. Here was wisdom that all his divine power could not match, an understanding of what it meant to live fully in the face of inevitable loss. In her brief mortal existence, she had learned things that immortals with all eternity before them might never discover. The philosophy she described was not one of passive resignation but of active choice. The decision to find meaning and beauty, even in the darkest circumstances, to transform suffering into an opportunity for grace. She had looked at her situation with clear eyes, acknowledged the reality of her danger, and chosen to respond with love rather than hate, with gratitude rather than bitterness. As the sake reached its peak potency, filling the air with fumes so concentrated that even sparrows would stumble in their flight after passing through the vapors, Susanoo felt the first tremors in the earth that announced Yamata-no-Orochi's approach. The serpent came at twilight, as it always did, when the boundary between day and night made the world uncertain and strange, when shadows grew long, and the familiar landscape transformed into something that seemed touched by otherworldly forces. The signs of the creature's approach were unmistakable to those who knew how to read them. The very insects fell silent first, their primitive nervous systems detecting vibrations in the earth that preceded the monster's arrival by hours. Birds abandoned their evening songs and roosted early, huddling together for comfort against the unnatural dread that seemed to seep from the ground itself.
Wait, don't miss what Susanoo found inside the serpent's tail. First came the sound, a rustling like wind through a 1,000-acre forest, but rhythmic and purposeful, the sound of something vast and muscled moving across the landscape with deliberate intent. The noise seemed to come from all directions at once, as if the creature's immense bulk was so large that it surrounded the valley rather than simply approaching it. Then came the smell, a mixture of ancient earth and old blood, of scales that had been bathed in mountain streams and mouths that had tasted too much death. The very air seemed to grow thick and oppressive, as if the creature's presence was so powerful that it displaced the normal atmosphere around it. Breathing became difficult, not because the air was thin but because it was too heavy, weighted down with malevolent intent and primordial hunger. The temperature began to drop, though not from any natural weather pattern. This was the cold that came from the presence of something that had never known warmth or compassion. The fence Susanoo had built was positioned in a valley between two low hills, carefully situated to take advantage of the natural geography that would channel the serpent's approach. The structure was deceptively simple in appearance. 8 wooden posts connected by bamboo rails with 8 openings that looked almost casual in their placement. But every measurement had been calculated with divine precision, every angle chosen to serve multiple purposes in the complex trap he was preparing. The 8 barrels were placed just inside the 8 openings, each barrel positioned to catch the light of the setting sun, so that the sake within gleamed like liquid gold, each one placed at exactly the right height and angle to be irresistible to the corresponding head when the creature arrived. The arrangement looked natural,
almost accidental, but it was the result of weeks of careful observation and planning. Everything was ready, every detail planned and prepared with meticulous care. The trap was set, the bait was perfect, the battlefield was chosen. Everything depended now on the serpent's ancient greed and Susanoo's ability to time his attack with perfect precision. There would be only one chance: if he moved too soon, the creature would not be sufficiently weakened by the alcohol. If he waited too long, the monster might grow suspicious and withdraw. Success required patience, timing, and the kind of controlled violence that he had never before attempted. This would not be the wild, destructive fury that had characterized his storms in heaven, but something far more difficult, power held in perfect check until the precise moment when it could be released with maximum effect. Yamata-no-Orochi appeared at the crest of the eastern hill just as the last light of day painted the sky, the color of old blood, its massive form silhouetted against the darkening heavens like a mountain come to life. Even knowing what to expect, even having prepared for this moment through weeks of careful planning, Susanoo felt his divine breath catch in his chest at the sight of the monster that had terrorized this peaceful land for so many years. It was larger than legend had described, more terrible than the most vivid nightmares could have imagined. Its 8 heads rose like a grove of serpentine trees, each one the size of a temple, each one moving with an intelligence that was ancient and alien and utterly without mercy. The heads swayed independently, like deadly flowers on impossibly long stems, each one surveying the landscape with eyes that burned with malevolent intelligence. Its eyes were indeed like winter berries, but berries that glowed with their own inner fire, reflecting depths of cunning and malice that spoke of aeons spent perfecting the art of destruction. The gaze of each head was different, some burned with simple hunger, others with calculating intelligence, still others with a kind of cosmic boredom that suggested the creature had grown weary of its own existence, but was compelled to continue by forces beyond its control. The scales that covered its immense body caught the dying light and threw it back in patterns that hurt to look at directly, creating optical illusions that made it difficult to judge the creature's exact size and position. The scales themselves were works of dark artistry, each one unique in its pattern and coloration, together forming a hide that seemed to shift and change like living shadow. Moss and small trees did indeed grow on its back, but these were not simply parasitic plants. They were part of an entire ecosystem that had developed during the serpent's long existence, a mobile forest that traveled wherever the monster went. Entire species of insects and small animals had evolved to live exclusively on the creature's back, never touching the ground, spending their entire lives in the shadow of ultimate predation. The body stretched back beyond the hill, disappearing into the growing darkness like a river of living shadow that seemed to have no end. This was not just a serpent, it was a landscape, an ecosystem, a piece of the primordial world that had somehow survived into the age of order and civilization. It was chaos given form and intelligence, destruction made manifest in flesh and scale, and burning eyes. Everything about this monster was more ancient than anyone suspected. The 8 heads turned toward the valley where Susanoo waited in hiding, and 16 eyes fixed on the glowing barrels of sake with an intensity that made the air around them shimmer like heat waves. The serpent had been coming to this place for so many years that it knew every stone, every tree, every scent on the wind. But tonight something was different. Tonight there was a smell that made its ancient hunger stir in new ways, an aroma that spoke to appetites that had been dormant for centuries. The creature's reaction to the sake was immediate and profound. Each head began to sway more slowly, more hypnotically, as if the mere scent of the alcohol was already affecting its behavior. Ancient memories stirred within its consciousness, memories of times when it had been honored rather than feared, when mortals had offered it gifts out of gratitude rather than terror. Slowly, ponderously, with movements that sent tremors through the ground and set off small avalanches on the surrounding hills, Yamata-no-Orochi descended into the valley. Each movement was carefully considered, for despite its enormous size, The creature possessed a serpentine grace that allowed it to move with surprising stealth when it chose to do so. The earth groaned under its weight, and new springs burst from the ground where its passage compressed the soil. Birds fled from the trees in silent clouds, their instincts screaming at them to escape the presence of this embodiment of primordial terror. Even the insects fell quiet, as if all of nature held its breath in the presence of something that represented everything wild and untamable about the world. Small animals that had not fled in time simply froze in place, paralyzed by terror so profound that it shut down their ability to move or think. The serpent approached the fence cautiously at first, its 8 heads weaving back and forth like dancers testing the rhythm of a new song. Each head moved independently, examining the trap from a different angle, searching for any sign of danger or deception. The creature had survived for millennia precisely because it never took anything at face value, because it had learned to be suspicious of any situation that seemed too convenient or too good to be true. But the smell of the sake was irresistible, growing stronger with each passing moment, calling to appetites that had been shaped by millions of years of evolution and refinement. The alcohol had been crafted specifically to appeal to the creature's most fundamental desires, each ingredient chosen not merely for its flavor but for its spiritual significance, its connection to the earth's fertility, and the patient human craft that could transform simple grain into something approaching the divine. One by one, the heads found the openings in the fence and pushed through to reach the barrels, each movement creating small earthquakes as the creature's massive bulk shifted to accommodate the new position. The sight was both magnificent and terrifying. 8 serpentine necks, each thicker than the largest tree trunk, extending through openings that had been precisely calculated to allow access while restricting the creature's ability to withdraw quickly. Susanoo watched from his hiding place behind a carefully chosen stand of bamboo, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword, every muscle in his divine body coiled and ready for action. The plan was working exactly as he had hoped, but he knew that this was the most dangerous moment. The serpent was powerful beyond imagining, intelligent beyond mortal comprehension, and capable of devastating violence even when partially incapacitated. One mistake, one moment of poor timing, and not only would he die, but Kusanagi would face the fate that had claimed her 7 sisters. The weight of responsibility was unlike anything he had ever experienced during his time in heaven, where his actions had consequences, but those consequences had seemed abstract and distant. Here the life of someone he had come to love hung in the balance of his decisions. The 8 heads began to drink, and the sound was like waterfalls pouring into deep caves, like the ocean itself being swallowed by some unimaginable throat. The creature's consumption was methodical and thorough. Each head drained its assigned barrel completely before moving on to investigate the others. Barrel after barrel emptied as the serpent consumed sake that would have felled a dozen mortal men, alcohol so potent that it had required weeks of careful brewing to achieve the perfect balance of strength and flavor. Susanoo had crafted this sake to be irresistible, not just in its taste but in its effects. Each drop contained not only the fermented essence of the finest rice, but also traces of his own divine power, carefully woven into the brewing process during the weeks of preparation. The alcohol would affect even a creature as ancient and powerful as Yamata-no-Orochi, but more than that, it would carry with it a subtle influence that would cloud the monster's judgment and slow its legendary reflexes. The divine essence he had infused into the sake was not the raw, destructive power he had wielded in his youth, but something more refined, the power of storms channeled into protection rather than destruction, the force of thunder transformed into healing rather than harm. It was a use of his abilities that he had never attempted before, requiring a delicate touch and an understanding of the relationship between power and purpose that his exile had taught him. As the alcohol began to take effect, the creature's movements grew looser, more relaxed. The constant tension that had marked its approach, the vigilant wariness of a predator that had survived for millennia by never lowering its guard, began to fade into a pleasant languor that was entirely foreign to its nature. The 8 heads swayed like grain in a gentle breeze, and the terrible intelligence in those fiery eyes began to dim and soften as the sake worked its way through the serpent's vast circulatory system. The transformation was gradual but unmistakable. The creature's movements, which had been sharp and predatory, became flowing and almost graceful. Its breathing, which had been quick and alert, deepened into the slower rhythm of relaxation. Most importantly, the calculating wariness that had kept it alive for countless centuries began to give way to a kind of dreamy contentment that left it vulnerable for the first time in its existence. This was the moment Susanoo had been waiting for, the culmination of weeks of careful planning and preparation. One by one, the heads settled down beside the empty barrels, the serpent's consciousness scattering and fading as the alcohol overwhelmed even its supernatural constitution. The great body relaxed, coiling loosely around the fence in a position that would have been impossible to achieve through force but which the creature had assumed voluntarily in its intoxicated state. Drawing his sword, a blade forged in the celestial workshops of his father, tempered in lightning and quenched in the tears of clouds, Susanoo emerged from his hiding place and approached the sleeping monster. The weapon blazed with divine light as it left its sheath, casting dancing shadows across the valley, and reflecting off the serpent's scales in patterns that seemed to write themselves across the landscape. The sword itself was a masterwork of divine craftsmanship, its blade forged from metals that existed only in the heavenly realm, its edge honed to a sharpness that could cut through the very fabric of reality. The hilt was wrapped in leather from creatures that had never known fear, and the pommel was set with a stone that contained fragments of the first star that had ever shone in the darkness of creation. But more than its physical properties, the sword carried within it the essence of Susanoo's transformation during his exile. Where once it had been a weapon of pure destruction, it had become something more complex, a tool of justice that could cut through evil while leaving innocence unharmed. A blade that could sever the bonds of malevolence while preserving the connections that bound the universe together in harmony. Up close, Yamata-no-Orochi was even more terrifying than it had appeared from a distance. Its breathing moved air like a massive bellows, and even in sleep, its scales rippled with contained power that spoke of forces beyond mortal comprehension. Each scale was a work of dark artistry, engraved with patterns that seemed to shift and change when viewed directly, covered with a patina that spoke of centuries spent in places where light had never penetrated. This was a creature that had existed since the world was young, that had seen the birth of mountains and the death of seas, that carried within its ancient flesh the memory of times when chaos ruled and order was nothing more than a distant dream. Its very presence was a link to the primordial forces that had shaped creation, a living reminder of the raw power that lay beneath the carefully constructed reality that gods and mortals had built together. Killing such a being would be like killing a piece of history itself, erasing from the world one of the last connections to the primordial forces that had shaped creation. For a moment, Susanoo hesitated, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he was about to do. This creature was evil, yes, and had caused immeasurable suffering, but it was also a relic of unimaginable age and power, a living link to mysteries that would die with it. The weight of the decision pressed down upon him like the depths of the ocean. He was about to end an existence that had persisted since the dawn of time, to snuff out a consciousness that held memories of the universe's youth. In some ways, Yamata-no-Orochi was as much a part of creation as the mountains and seas, as integral to the cosmic order as the cycle of seasons or the progression of day and night. But then he thought of Kusanagi, of her quiet courage and her terrible loss, of the 7 sisters who had died before her, and all the other innocents who might die if this creature continued to exist. He thought of the children, who would grow up in terror as long as Yamata-no-Orochi lived, of the families who would be torn apart, of the creative and beautiful lives that would be snuffed out to feed an ancient hunger that knew no satisfaction. He thought too of the transformation he had undergone during his exile, of the lessons he had learned about the difference between power and responsibility, between strength and protection. This was not about proving his might or demonstrating his superiority. This was about using his abilities to shield the innocent and preserve the conditions that allowed beauty and goodness to flourish in the world. His sword blazed with divine light as he raised it high, and in that moment, he felt the presence of all the gods watching him, his father Izanagi, his sister Amaterasu, even the spirits of the mortal realm who had suffered under the serpent's reign of terror. This was not just a battle between a god and a monster, but a contest between order and chaos, between the forces that nurtured life and those that consumed it without purpose or mercy. "You won't believe what the eighth daughter whispered to the wind." The blade sang through the air and bit deep into the serpent's nearest neck, divine steel meeting scales that had never known the touch of mortal weapons. The impact sent sparks flying like falling stars, and the sound of metal against primordial hide rang across the valley like the tolling of some vast bell. The collision between divine power and ancient evil created harmonics that resonated through multiple dimensions, sending ripples through the fabric of reality itself. The serpent's blood was black, as midnight and hot as molten stone, and where it touched the ground, flowers wilted and stones cracked, as if the very earth recoiled from contact with such ancient corruption. The blood carried within it the essence of primordial chaos, the raw stuff of creation before order had been imposed upon it. Wherever it fell, reality became unstable, causing small tears in the fabric of space through which glimpses of other worlds could be seen. Yamata-no-Orochi woke with a roar that shattered windows in villages 10 miles away, a sound that seemed to come not just from its 8 throats but from the very bedrock beneath the mountains. The alcohol had dulled its reflexes but had not destroyed its fundamental nature, and suddenly Susanoo found himself in a battle that tested every ounce of his divine strength and skill. Every lesson he had learned during his exile about the difference between destructive power and protective force. The 8 heads thrashed in pain and rage, each one moving with deadly purpose despite the intoxication that clouded the creature's thoughts. They struck at him like living battering rams, each attack capable of crushing stone or splitting trees, each movement creating winds strong enough to knock a mortal warrior from his feet. The air filled with the creature's roars of pain and fury, sounds that contained harmonics of such deep bass that they caused avalanches in distant mountain ranges. But Susanoo was no longer the reckless god who had been banished from heaven. His time in the mortal world had taught him patience, precision, and the kind of focused determination that could only come from fighting for something more important than personal glory. This was not about proving his strength or venting his anger. This was about protecting someone he loved and preserving the peace that allowed mortal life to flourish. He danced between the attacking heads with movements that seemed almost choreographed, his sword weaving patterns of light in the darkness as he sought openings between the creature's defenses. Each cut drew more of that terrible black blood, each successful strike bringing him closer to victory but also increasing the serpent's fury and desperation. The battle became a deadly ballet, divine grace pitted against primordial fury in a contest that would determine the fate of the entire region. The ground beneath his feet turned to mud mixed with the creature's life force, making footing treacherous and uncertain. The air filled with a mist that burned his eyes and throat with its supernatural toxicity, forcing him to rely on senses beyond the physical to track the movement of his enemy. Lightning crackled between the serpent's scales as its death throes released the electrical energy it had accumulated over millennia of existence. The battle raged through the night, a contest between divine skill and primordial fury that shook the very foundations of the mountains around them. In distant temples, priests woke from dreams of ending worlds and hurried to their altars to pray for the forces of order to triumph over chaos. Wise women consulting their scrying pools saw visions of cosmic significance in the patterns of blood and light that marked each exchange between god and monster. The conflict was not merely physical but spiritual, a clash between two different understandings of what existence should be. Yamata-no-Orochi represented the raw power of chaos, the belief that might alone determined right, that the strong had no obligation to consider the welfare of the weak. Susanoo fought for a different vision, one in which power carried responsibility, in which strength was meant to protect rather than dominate. Each blow he struck was guided not by rage but by purpose, each movement calculated to achieve his goal with minimal collateral damage to the surrounding landscape. This was perhaps the most difficult aspect of the battle, restraining his power even while fighting for his life, ensuring that his victory would not come at the cost of destroying the very thing he sought to protect. But gradually, inevitably, Susanoo's divine power and hard-won wisdom proved stronger than even this ancient creature's desperate will to survive. His blade found neck after neck, severing heads with cuts that carried not just physical force but the accumulated weight of his determination to protect those he had come to love. The sword seemed to sing with each strike, its celestial metal resonating with harmonies that spoke of justice fulfilled and evil vanquished. 7 heads fell to the earth with sounds like toppling trees, each one continuing to writhe and snap for several minutes after being severed, as if the creature's malevolent will was so strong that it persisted even after death. The ground where they fell was scarred by their final struggles, marked with gouges that would remain visible for centuries as reminders of this cosmic battle. Only one head remained, weaving desperately back and forth as it tried to escape the reach of his blazing sword. This final head was the largest and most intelligent of the 8, the one that had served as the creature's primary consciousness and had coordinated the actions of its siblings throughout their long existence. Its eyes burned with a hatred so pure and concentrated that looking into them was like staring into the heart of malevolence itself. The final cut was the deepest and most precise, delivered not in rage or triumph but with the kind of calm certainty that came from knowing he was doing what needed to be done. The blade passed through the creature's neck with surprising ease, as if the serpent's own accumulated evil had weakened the bonds that held its flesh together. As the last head fell, Yamata-no-Orochi's body convulsed once with a shudder that ran from its massive coils to the very tips of its 8 tails, and then lay still. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the sound of Susanoo's breathing and the distant whisper of wind through bamboo. It was the kind of silence that follows the end of a great storm, when the air itself seems exhausted by the violence that has passed through it. Stars that had been hidden by the supernatural darkness surrounding the battle began to reappear, their gentle light slowly returning to a world that had been cleansed of ancient evil. But the god's work was not finished. Something had been nagging at him throughout the battle, a sense that there was more to this creature than simple malevolence, that its long existence and supernatural nature might have accumulated secrets that would die with it unless he took the time to investigate. As he began to cut the serpent's body into pieces, partly to ensure it could never regenerate, partly to examine the monster that had terrorized the land for so long, his sword struck something hard and metallic inside one of the 8 tails. But the real secret lay hidden in the serpent's 8 hearts. Working carefully, using the precision he had learned during his exile rather than the brute force of his earlier divine existence, Susanoo cut open the tail and found within it a sword unlike any he had ever seen. Its blade was perfectly straight and gleaming white, untouched by the corruption that had surrounded it for who knew how many centuries. The metal seemed to glow with its own inner light, and the craftsmanship was so perfect that it made even his own celestial weapon seem crude by comparison. The discovery was so unexpected that he nearly dropped his own sword in amazement. Here in the belly of ultimate evil lay a weapon of such purity and beauty that it seemed to have been forged by the very forces of creation themselves. The blade was longer than any sword he had seen, but perfectly balanced, its weight distributed with such precision that it felt weightless in his hands despite its obvious substance. The hilt was wrapped in silk that shimmered with colors that seemed to shift and change as he watched, cycling through hues that had no names in any mortal language. The guard was crafted from a metal that looked like silver but felt warm to the touch, engraved with symbols that seemed to move and dance when viewed from the corner of his eye. The pommel was set with a stone that contained what looked like a captured star, pulsing with gentle light that made the surrounding darkness seem less oppressive. Along the blade were inscribed characters in a script so ancient that even his divine knowledge could barely decipher them. The writing seemed to shift between different languages and symbolic systems, as if the sword existed outside the normal flow of time and could communicate with beings from any era of creation. As he studied the inscriptions, he began to understand that this was not merely a weapon but an artifact of cosmic significance. This was Kusanagi, the grass-cutting sword, a blade forged in the time before memory by spirits whose names had been forgotten even by the gods. The weapon had been created during the early days of the world when the boundary between order and chaos was still being established, crafted by beings who understood secrets of metallurgy and magic that had been lost for thousands of years. The sword's history was written in the patterns of its metal, a story that unfolded in Susanoo's consciousness as he held the weapon. It had been forged in the first forge that had ever burned, tempered in waters that had flowed before the first rain, cooled in winds that had blown before the first storm. The metal itself had been drawn from the heart of a star that had died to provide the raw materials for creation, making the blade literally a fragment of the cosmic fire that had given birth to all things. How it had come to rest inside Yamata-no-Orochi's tail was a mystery that would probably never be fully solved, but Susanoo understood immediately that this was a treasure beyond price, a weapon that belonged not to him but to the mortal realm he had saved. The sword carried within its steel the power to cut through more than mere physical obstacles. It could sever the bonds that held chaos to the world, could slice through the very fabric of malevolent magic, could serve as a bridge between the divine and mortal realms. The blade seemed to recognize his worthiness to wield it, responding to his touch with a subtle warmth that spoke of approval and acceptance. When he moved it through the air, it left trails of light that lingered for several seconds, and the sound it made was not the harsh whistle of ordinary steel but a musical note of such purity that it seemed to cleanse the very air through which it passed. As dawn broke over the battlefield, painting the sky in shades of pearl and gold that seemed to wash away the darkness of the night's violence, Susanoo gathered the pieces of Yamata-no-Orochi and scattered them to the 8 directions. He sent each fragment far enough that no part of the creature could ever reunite with any other part, ensuring that this ancient evil could never return to threaten the peace of the mortal world. The ritual of dismemberment was more than mere practicality. It was a symbolic act that represented the final triumph of order over chaos, the definitive end of an era when monsters could terrorize entire regions without consequence. Each piece was blessed as he scattered it, transformed from a fragment of evil into a seed of renewal that would nourish the land for generations to come. The serpent's blood soaked into the earth and would, in generations to come, make the soil rich and fertile, as if even in death the monster could nourish the world it had once terrorized. The places where the creature's essence touched the ground would become known for producing rice of extraordinary quality, vegetables of unusual size and flavor, and flowers that bloomed with colors so vivid they seemed to glow with their own inner light. The transformation was already beginning as he watched. Where the black blood had fallen, new plants were already beginning to sprout, not the withered, corrupted growths that might have been expected, but healthy shoots that seemed to carry within them an unusual vitality. The corruption had been cleansed by the creature's death, leaving behind only the raw creative force that had been trapped within its malevolent form. Kusanagi was waiting for him at the edge of the valley, and when she saw him approaching with the dawn light behind him and the miraculous sword gleaming in his hand, Her calm composure finally broke and she ran to meet him. For the first time since he had known her, he saw tears in her eyes. Not tears of grief or fear, but tears of relief and joy, and something deeper that made his exiled heart feel suddenly light and whole. She had waited through the entire night, listening to the sounds of battle that echoed across the mountains, feeling each tremor in the earth that marked another exchange between divine sword and primordial fury. She had not slept or sought shelter, but had stood vigil like a lighthouse keeper watching for a ship to return from dangerous waters, holding faith that the storm god who had promised to save her would find a way to triumph over forces that had seemed utterly invincible. Her vigil had not been passive but active, spent in prayers and meditations that had sent streams of spiritual energy to support Susanoo during the most difficult moments of his battle. Though she possessed no divine power in the conventional sense, her faith and love had served as an anchor that kept him connected to his purpose when the fury of combat might otherwise have overwhelmed his newly learned restraint. "It's over," he told her simply, his voice hoarse from the night's exertions but filled with a quiet satisfaction that went deeper than mere victory. The words carried within them not just the announcement of triumph but a promise that the terror was ended, that she was safe, that they could now build a life together free from the shadow of ancient evil. She nodded and took his hands in hers, not caring that they were still stained with the serpent's blood, not flinching from the residual heat and power that crackled around his divine form. Her touch was gentle but certain, conveying acceptance and love without the need for words. In that moment, as they stood together at the edge of the battlefield where order had triumphed over chaos, both of them understood that something fundamental had changed not just in the world around them but in their own natures. Susanoo was no longer the exiled god wandering aimlessly through the mortal realm, consumed by anger and self-pity. Kusanagi was no longer the last daughter waiting passively for death to claim her. They had both been transformed by the experience of facing ultimate terror together, and discovering that love could indeed provide the strength needed to overcome even the most ancient evil. And then the earth itself began to tremble with the beast's awakening. But this time, the trembling was not the approach of another monster but the response of the land itself to the liberation it had just experienced. The earth shook with joy rather than fear, celebrating the removal of the malevolent presence that had oppressed it for so many years. Springs burst forth from hillsides that had been dry for decades, and flowers bloomed in patterns that seemed to spell out messages of gratitude in languages older than human speech. They were married in a ceremony that lasted 3 days and 3 nights, blessed by every kami for 100 miles around who came to witness the union between the storm god and the earth spirit who had taught him the meaning of protection. The wedding was not a simple exchange of vows but a cosmic event that helped to heal the wounds that Yamata-no-Orochi's reign of terror had inflicted upon the spiritual fabric of the region. The ceremony took place not in a single location but across multiple sacred sites, as if the entire landscape wanted to participate in celebrating the transformation that had taken place. The first day's rituals were held in the valley where the battle had been fought, now transformed into a garden of impossible beauty where every plant seemed to glow with inner light, and every flower released fragrances that could heal old sorrows. Even spirits who had fled from Susanoo's presence during his exile came to offer their congratulations, for word had spread quickly through the supernatural realm that the storm god had found his purpose at last. River spirits emerged from their hidden pools to dance in honor of the couple, their movements creating rainbows in the spray of waterfalls. Mountain spirits descended from their peaks to offer gifts of precious stones and metals, each gem chosen for its symbolic significance rather than its monetary value. The first day was devoted to honoring the 7 sisters who had been lost, with rituals that helped their spirits find peace and ensured that their unique gifts would not be entirely lost to the world. Singers came from distant provinces to perform songs that echoed the eldest sister's healing voice, their melodies carrying across the landscape like prayers made audible. Weavers brought tapestries that attempted to capture something of the second sister's magical artistry, working throughout the night to create patterns that seemed to move and breathe with life of their own.
Each lost daughter was remembered not just as a victim but as a contributor to the world's beauty and wisdom. Shrines were erected in their honor, each one designed to embody the particular gift that sister had brought to the world. The shrine to the eldest contained pools of water that reflected not the present but memories of joy, allowing visitors to see echoes of happier times. The shrine to the weaver was filled with looms that worked by themselves, creating textiles that told the ongoing story of the region's healing. The second day focused on the purification of the land itself, with ceremonies designed to cleanse away the last traces of the serpent's malevolent influence and prepare the region for a new era of peace and prosperity. Sacred fires were lit on mountaintops, each flame kindled with wood from trees that had survived the monster's depredations, their smoke carrying prayers of gratitude to the heavenly realm. Priests performed rituals that called down blessings from the celestial kami to replace the curses that had lingered in the air for so many years. Water from the sacred lake that had formed at the site of Susanoo's first landing was carried to every village and farm in the region, used to bless crops and livestock, and to create protective barriers around homes and temples. The third day was pure celebration, a festival of life and love and hope that drew participants from across the entire archipelago. The news of Yamata-no-Orochi's defeat had spread with supernatural speed, carried by wind spirits and bird messengers to every corner of Japan. People came not just to witness the wedding but to participate in the celebration of liberation from an evil that had cast its shadow over the entire land. Musicians played until their fingers bled, but their instruments seemed to heal themselves and produce sounds of impossible beauty. Dancers spun until they collapsed from exhaustion, only to rise again refreshed and ready to continue their celebrations. Storytellers wove new tales that would carry the memory of this triumph to future generations who might otherwise forget the price that had been paid for their peace. The moment Susanoo raised the sacred sword, fate itself shifted. Amaterasu herself descended from the heavenly realm to attend the wedding, bringing with her not only her blessing but formal forgiveness and an end to her brother's banishment. Her presence transformed the already magnificent ceremony into something that transcended mortal celebration and approached the sacred mysteries that governed the cosmic order. The sun goddess appeared not in her full divine glory, which would have been too overwhelming for mortal senses, but in a form of gentle radiance that warmed the heart without blinding the eyes. Her arrival was preceded by phenomena that left no doubt about her divine nature. Flowers that had never bloomed in that climate suddenly appeared, birds began to sing in harmonies that had never been heard before, and the very air seemed to shimmer with golden light. When she spoke, her voice carried the warmth of summer mornings and the promise of abundant harvests, but also the authority of one who had helped to establish the cosmic order itself. "You have learned to use your strength to protect rather than destroy," she told Susanoo as they embraced beneath a sky full of celebratory stars that seemed to have arranged themselves into new constellations for the occasion. "Heaven has a place for you again, if you wish to return to your former glory and power." The offer was genuine and generous, carrying with it not only forgiveness but the restoration of all the privileges and responsibilities that Susanoo had lost through his banishment. He could return to Takamagahara, resume his position in the celestial hierarchy, command the storms of heaven once again with the full authority of divine rank. His exile could be erased as if it had never happened, his disgrace forgotten in the face of his redemption. But Susanoo looked at his new wife, at the mortal realm where he had found love and purpose, and a kind of wisdom that no amount of celestial authority could provide, and shook his head with a certainty that surprised even him. "My place is here now," he said quietly, "where the storms can serve the people instead of frightening them, where power can be used to nurture rather than dominate." Amaterasu smiled with an expression that contained both pride and a touch of sadness, understanding that her brother had indeed found something in the mortal world that was more valuable to him than all the privileges of divine rank. She had hoped to welcome him back to the celestial realm,
but she recognized that his choice was not a rejection of his family, but an affirmation of the growth he had achieved during his exile. She blessed the union with her own hands, weaving into their marriage bonds a protection that would endure for as long as their love remained true. The blessing took the form of golden threads that became visible only in certain lights, connecting Susanoo and Kusanagi not just as husband and wife, but as partners in the ongoing work of maintaining the balance between the divine and mortal realms. The Kusanagi sword, that miraculous blade that had emerged from the serpent's tail like a gift hidden within a curse, Susanoo presented to the Emperor of Japan in a ceremony that established a sacred trust between the divine and mortal realms. The presentation took place at the imperial palace, in the presence of the court and representatives from every province of the archipelago. The emperor received the sword with appropriate reverence, understanding that he was being entrusted not just with a weapon but with a sacred responsibility. The blade would serve as a symbol of the divine mandate to protect the innocent and preserve the conditions that allowed civilization to flourish. Future emperors would draw the sword in times of great crisis, and always they would feel the presence of the storm god and his mortal bride, guiding them toward choices that protected rather than conquered. The weapon became one of the three imperial treasures, joining the mirror of Amaterasu and the jewels of the sea goddess to form a trinity of sacred objects that represented the connection between heaven and earth. Each treasure embodied a different aspect of divine authority. The mirror represented wisdom and truth, the jewels represented compassion and abundance, and the sword represented the just use of power in protection of the innocent. What happened next would determine the destiny of all Japan. As for Yamata-no-Orochi, the great serpent passed into legend with a complexity that reflected its true nature as something more than a simple monster. Its story was told and retold until it became a symbol of the chaos that existed before civilization, the darkness that heroes must face in order to bring light to the world. Children would hear the tale and learn that even the most terrible monsters could be defeated by courage, cleverness, and the power of love. But there were other lessons in the story, quieter truths that wise listeners discovered in the spaces between the words. The tale spoke of redemption, of how even gods could learn and grow and change when they opened themselves to experiences beyond their previous understanding. It whispered of the strength that could be found in ordinary people who faced extraordinary trials with grace and dignity. It suggested that sometimes the greatest victories came not from destroying one's enemies, but from finding something worth protecting and learning to channel one's power in service of that protection. The story also served as a reminder that the battle between order and chaos was not a single decisive conflict, but an ongoing struggle that required constant vigilance and renewed commitment in each generation. Other monsters might arise, other threats might emerge from the dark corners of the world, but the example of Susanoo and Kusanagi would endure as proof that such challenges could be met and overcome. The serpent's defeat also marked a turning point in the relationship between the divine and mortal realms. No longer would the gods rule from distant heaven without understanding the struggles and sorrows of earthly existence. Susanoo's choice to remain in the mortal world established a precedent that encouraged other divine beings to take a more active role in protecting and nurturing the communities they had been created to serve. The marriage between storm god and earth spirit became a template for cooperation between different aspects of the natural world, showing that apparent opposites could work together in harmony when united by common purpose and mutual respect. The union of divine power and mortal wisdom created a new model for governance that would influence Japanese culture for millennia to come. In the years that followed, Susanoo and Kusanagi lived quietly in the mountains of Izumo, where the storm god learned the arts of peace with the same dedication he had once applied to mastering the forces of destruction. He discovered the pleasure of watching rice grow in fields he had helped to water with gentle rains that came at precisely the right times and in exactly the right amounts. He found joy in the laughter of children who played in gardens he protected from harsh winds and devastating storms. Their home was built on the site where they had first met, in the clearing surrounded by ancient cedars that had witnessed their initial encounter. The house itself was simple but beautiful, constructed with materials donated by spirits from throughout the region who wanted to contribute to the building of something that symbolized hope and renewal. The walls were made from wood that had been blessed by tree spirits, the roof was thatched with grass that had been woven by wind spirits, and the foundation was set with stones that had been polished smooth by water spirits. Most importantly, he learned that divine power was most beautiful when it served mortal happiness, when it was used not to demonstrate superiority, but to create conditions in which fragile human lives could flourish and grow. The seasonal storms he brought were no longer destructive but nurturing, bringing the right amount of rain at the right times, clearing the air of impurities, filling the rivers that fed the rice paddies, and the wells that sustained the villages. His weather working became a form of art as much as utility, with each storm carefully crafted to serve specific purposes. Spring rains would fall gently and consistently, providing the steady moisture needed for planting without washing away seeds or seedlings. Summer storms would arrive with dramatic flair but would pass quickly, clearing oppressive heat and humidity, while providing spectacular displays of lightning that harmed nothing but delighted observers. Autumn winds would blow just hard enough to help farmers separate grain from chaff, and winter snows would fall in patterns that protected dormant plants while creating landscapes of breathtaking beauty. The people of Izumo came to see him not as a god to be feared but as a protector to be grateful for, and they built shrines in his honor where they left offerings of sake and rice and simple prayers for good weather. These were not the elaborate temples that had been erected to appease his former destructive nature, but humble structures that reflected the genuine affection and respect of people who had learned to trust in his benevolent protection. The shrines were built in locations where his presence could be most easily felt, on hilltops where the wind could carry prayers directly to him, beside streams where the water sang with his blessings, in groves where his wife's influence could be sensed in the health and vigor of the growing things. Each shrine was unique, reflecting the particular needs and character of the community that maintained it, but all shared common elements that spoke of gratitude and trust. But hidden in the serpent's death was a gift no god expected. Kusanagi aged as mortals do, her hair growing silver like moonlight on water, her face gaining lines that spoke of years filled with laughter and contentment, and the kind of deep peace that comes from a life lived in harmony with natural cycles. But to Susanoo, she remained always as beautiful as she had been on that night when he first saw her courage in the face of certain death, her dignity in the face of overwhelming terror. He treasured each day of their mortal life together, knowing that unlike his divine existence which stretched toward infinity, these moments would not last forever. This knowledge made each shared sunrise more precious, each evening conversation more meaningful, each simple gesture of affection more profound than all the cosmic forces he had once commanded. The awareness of mortality that he gained through his relationship with Kusanagi transformed his understanding of existence in fundamental ways. Where once he had taken eternity for granted, assuming that time was limitless and therefore meaningless, he now understood that the temporary nature of mortal life was what gave it meaning and urgency. Every moment was precious precisely because it would not last forever. She bore him children, who were blessed with aspects of both their natures, mortals who lived ordinary lifespans but possessed subtle gifts that allowed them to serve as bridges between the human and divine worlds. Some became priests and priestesses who could interpret the will of the kami with unusual accuracy, their connection to their divine father allowing them to sense spiritual truths that escaped ordinary perception. Others became craftspeople whose work carried traces of supernatural beauty and power, creating objects that seemed to glow with inner light and possess qualities that went beyond mere aesthetics. Their pottery held water that stayed fresh for unnaturally long periods, their textiles provided protection against evil influences, and their metalwork produced tools that never dulled and weapons that struck only where they were intended to strike. Still others became leaders who governed with a wisdom that seemed to come from sources beyond mere human experience. making decisions that served not just immediate needs but the long-term welfare of their communities. They understood the delicate balance between human needs and natural systems, creating policies that allowed civilization to flourish without destroying the environment that sustained it. Through these children and their descendants, the union between Susanoo and Kusanagi continued to bless the land long after their own story had ended. The bloodline carried within it a protection against the kind of ancient evils that Yamata-no-Orochi had represented, ensuring that future generations would have champions who could rise to meet supernatural threats with both human courage and divine power. When at last age claimed Kusanagi, Susanoo did not rage against fate as he might have in his youth, when his response to any obstacle had been to unleash storms that devastated everything in their path. Instead, he carried her spirit to the realm of the honored dead with a tenderness that transformed even death into an act of love, ensuring that she would wait for him in a place of peace and beauty when his own time of service in the mortal world was finished. The transition was marked not by violence or despair but by a gentle transformation that seemed to embody everything their life together had represented. As her mortal form faded, she became something more, not less human but more than human, a spirit that retained all her essential qualities while gaining the ability to exist beyond the constraints of physical existence. Her death became a teaching about the nature of love itself, demonstrating that true affection was not diminished by loss, but was instead refined and purified, becoming something that could endure beyond the temporary separations that death imposed upon mortal existence. Susanoo learned that grief was not the opposite of love, but was love in a different form, love faced with the reality of loss, but choosing to continue loving despite that loss. And then he returned to continue his work of protection, carrying her memory like a light in his heart that guided him through the centuries that followed. He had learned that love was not diminished by loss, but was instead refined and purified, becoming something that could endure beyond the temporary separations that death imposed upon mortal existence. His protection of the region continued for centuries, his influence gradually expanding to cover larger and larger areas as his reputation for benevolent guardianship spread. Villages that had never known his direct protection began to report unusually favorable weather, crops that grew with unusual vigor, and natural disasters that somehow missed their territories while devastating neighboring regions that lacked such supernatural guardianship. The valley where Yamata-no-Orochi had died became a place of pilgrimage, where people came to remember the story and to pray for protection from the monsters that still lurked in the dark corners of the world. Some said that on certain nights, when the wind was just right and the moon was dark, you could still hear the echo of the serpent's death cry carried on the breeze, a reminder that evil, no matter how ancient or powerful, could ultimately be defeated by those brave enough to stand against it. The battlefield itself had been transformed into a garden of extraordinary beauty, where every plant seemed to grow with unusual vigor and produce flowers or fruit of exceptional quality.
Pilgrims would gather soil from this sacred ground to bless their own gardens, and farmers would bring water from the streams that flowed through the valley to ensure good harvests in their distant fields. Others claimed that flowers grew more beautifully there than anywhere else, as if the earth itself remembered and was grateful for the sacrifice that had been made on its behalf. The flowers that bloomed in that valley were unlike any that grew elsewhere. They possessed colors that seemed to shift and change depending on the observer's mood, fragrances that could heal old griefs and awaken forgotten hopes, and a luminescence that made them visible even in complete darkness. The transformation of the battlefield into a place of beauty rather than desolation served as a powerful symbol of the possibility of redemption, the idea that even the sites of great violence and evil could be cleansed and renewed through acts of courage and love. The garden became a destination for those seeking healing from trauma, with many visitors reporting that their old wounds, both physical and spiritual, were eased by spending time among the miraculous flowers that grew there. The 8 heads of the serpent, according to legend, had become 8 mountain peaks that stood as sentinels around the valley, their stone faces turned forever outward to watch for any other creatures that might threaten the peaceful land. Each peak was said to possess its own protective spirit, a fragment of the divine power that Susanoo had used to defeat the monster, ensuring that the region would never again be vulnerable to the kind of ancient evil that had once terrorized it. These mountains were not natural formations but had emerged from the earth in the days following the battle, growing with supernatural speed until they formed a protective ring around the sacred valley. Each peak was perfectly positioned to provide both physical and spiritual protection, their height and placement creating weather patterns that shielded the region from natural disasters while their spiritual presence warded off supernatural threats. The 8 tails had become 8 rivers that flowed through the surrounding provinces, bringing life and fertility wherever they ran. These waterways were known for their clarity and purity, and for the unusual vigor they brought to any crops watered with their flow. Fishermen claimed that these rivers produced fish of extraordinary size and flavor, while farmers discovered that rice grown in fields irrigated by these streams could survive droughts and floods that destroyed other crops. The rivers seemed to possess an intelligence of their own, changing their courses when necessary to bring water to areas experiencing drought, but always returning to their original paths when the crisis had passed. During times of flood, they would overflow their banks in patterns that irrigated fields rather than destroying them, and during droughts they would run deeper and clearer than normal, as if drawing water from some inexhaustible underground source. And in the imperial palace, carefully guarded in its sacred shrine, Kusanagi rested as a reminder that true strength came not from the power to destroy but from the wisdom to know when and how to use that power in service of others. Emperors would draw the sword in times of great crisis, and always they would feel the presence of the storm god and his mortal bride, guiding them toward choices that protected rather than conquered, that nurtured rather than dominated. The sword served not just as a symbol but as an active force for good, its presence in the imperial treasury, ensuring that Japan would always have access to divine protection in times of greatest need. The blade itself remained unchanged by the passage of time, its metal as bright and sharp as the day it had been forged, its power undiminished by the centuries that had passed since its discovery. As the years passed and became decades, and the decades became centuries, the story of Yamata-no-Orochi grew and changed in the telling, as all great stories do. Poets added verses about the serpent's origin, claiming it had been born from the tears of the earth itself in the time before the first sunrise, when sorrow was the only emotion that existed in the void between order and chaos. The poets' versions of the tale emphasized different aspects of the story depending on the era in which they were composed. During times of war, the focus fell on Susanoo's martial prowess and the importance of courage in the face of overwhelming odds. During periods of peace, the emphasis shifted to the love story between the storm god and the earth spirit, celebrating the transformative power of affection and mutual respect. Painters depicted the battle in scrolls that captured the terrible beauty of divine power meeting primordial chaos, showing Susanoo not as a conquering hero, but as a figure of tragic nobility, understanding the cost of the victory he was achieving. Their art emphasized the melancholy aspect of the tale, the knowledge that in destroying Yamata-no-Orochi, the world was losing something irreplaceable, a connection to its own ancient past. The artistic representations evolved over time, reflecting changing cultural values and aesthetic preferences. Early paintings showed the serpent as purely monstrous, emphasizing its alien nature and the threat it posed to human civilization. Later works portrayed the creature with more complexity, acknowledging its ancient majesty even while depicting its malevolence. Theater performers brought the tale to life on stages across Japan, each generation finding new meanings in the ancient story, and new ways to make it relevant to their own struggles and aspirations. Sometimes the emphasis fell on the romance between god and mortal, sometimes on the theme of redemption through sacrifice, sometimes on the eternal battle between order and chaos that plays out in every human heart. The theatrical versions of the story became increasingly elaborate over time, incorporating music, dance, and spectacular visual effects to create experiences that transported audiences into the mythical world of gods and monsters.
The most skilled performers could bring audiences to tears during the scenes depicting the loss of the seven sisters, then lift their spirits with the triumph over evil and the celebration of love conquering death. But through all these retellings, certain elements remained constant, like stones in a riverbed that persist despite the changing currents flowing over them. The serpent was always vast and terrible, a creature from the time before order, before civilization, before the gentle domestication of the wild world. Susanoo was always the exiled god learning to find purpose beyond his own anger and pain, discovering that true power lay not in dominance but in protection. Kusanagi was always the brave daughter who faced death with dignity and found love in the most unlikely place, whose quiet strength provided the foundation for transformation and redemption. And always the story ended with victory, not just the victory of good over evil, but the more complex victory of wisdom over impulse, of protection over destruction, of love over loneliness. It was a story that spoke to something deep in the human heart, the knowledge that even in the darkest times, even when faced with seemingly impossible odds, courage and cleverness and compassion could light the way forward. It reminded listeners that monsters existed to be overcome, that heroes could be made from the most unlikely materials, and that sometimes the greatest victories required not the destruction of one's enemies but the transformation of oneself. The tale provided comfort during times of trouble and inspiration during periods of stagnation. Parents would tell it to children to teach them about courage and perseverance, while scholars would study it to understand the relationship between divine and human nature. Soldiers would recall it before battle to remind themselves that victory was possible even against overwhelming odds, while lovers would share it to celebrate the power of affection to transform and redeem. In remote mountain shrines, priests still perform rituals that honor both Susanoo and Yamata-no-Orochi, recognizing that the serpent, too, had played a necessary role in the cosmic order. Without the monster, the god would never have learned to be a protector. Without the terror, there would have been no opportunity for heroism. Without the darkness, the light would have no meaning or purpose. These rituals acknowledged the complexity of existence, the understanding that good and evil were not always as clearly separated as they might appear in simple moral tales. The serpent represented not just malevolence but also the raw forces of nature that could be destructive or creative depending on how they were channeled. Its defeat was not the elimination of these forces but their transformation into something beneficial. The sake that had been the serpent's downfall became a sacred element in these ceremonies, offered to the spirits with prayers for protection and guidance. Each cup raised was a reminder that even the most dangerous forces could be transformed into something beneficial when approached with wisdom and respect, that the same elements that could destroy could also nourish and heal when properly understood and applied. The brewing of ceremonial sake became an art form in itself, with master brewers spending decades learning the techniques that Susanoo and Kusanagi had used to create the alcohol that had defeated the monster. The finest sake was said to carry within it echoes of that original brew, possessing qualities that could calm anger, inspire courage, and strengthen the bonds between people who shared it. Modern Japan still carries echoes of the ancient story in ways both obvious and subtle. In times of natural disaster, when earthquakes shake the islands or typhoons lash the coasts with winds that seem to carry the fury of angry gods, people remember Susanoo and draw strength from the knowledge that storms can be survived, that destruction can lead to renewal, that even gods must sometimes learn hard lessons about the responsible use of power. The story provides a framework for understanding the relationship between humanity and the natural world, teaching that cooperation and respect are more effective than domination and exploitation. The marriage between Susanoo and Kusanagi serves as a model for the kind of partnership between different forces that can create harmony rather than conflict. The mountains of Izumo still draw visitors who come seeking peace and perspective, walking the paths where legend says the storm god and his mortal wife once walked together in harmony with the changing seasons. The valleys still grow rice that seems somehow more golden than rice grown elsewhere, and the streams still run clearer than streams that have not been blessed by divine gratitude and mortal courage. These pilgrimage sites have become places where people can reconnect with the natural world and find healing for the spiritual wounds that modern life often inflicts. The sacred geography created by the ancient battle continues to provide sanctuary for those seeking renewal and transformation, offering a refuge from the chaos and confusion of contemporary existence. And sometime, on nights when the wind carries the scent of distant rains and the stars shine with unusual brightness, travelers in those mountains report seeing figures walking together in the moonlight, a tall man whose steps create tiny sparks in the earth, and a woman whose presence makes the flowers turn their faces toward her, even in darkness. They walk hand in hand through the landscape they once saved, still protecting, still loving, still teaching by their example that the greatest storms can birth the gentlest rain, that the most powerful forces can learn to serve rather than dominate, that love can indeed transform even gods and monsters into something worthy of the beautiful, fragile world they share. The story continues in every storm that brings needed rain without devastating floods, in every act of courage that faces terror with dignity, in every love that chooses protection over possession. Yamata-no-Orochi lives on not as a monster to be feared but as a reminder of the chaos that still exists at the edges of order, waiting to test each generation's commitment to the values that make civilization possible. And Susanoo and Kusanagi live on as symbols of the transformation that becomes possible when power chooses to serve love, when strength learns to protect rather than dominate, when immortal forces discover that the greatest glory lies not in conquest but in the patient, daily work of nurturing the precious temporary beauty of mortal existence. So ends the tale of Yamata-no-Orochi, the eight-headed serpent whose death brought forth a sword of legends and a love that transcended the boundaries between divine and mortal, storm and calm, ancient chaos and eternal peace. In its telling, we remember that monsters exist to be overcome, that heroes can be made from the most unlikely materials, and that sometimes the greatest victories are won not through strength alone, but through the patient cultivation of wisdom, courage, and compassion. Sleep well, dear listeners, and may your dreams be filled with the gentle rain that comes after storms, the quiet strength that faces fear without flinching, and the abiding knowledge that even the darkest valleys can bloom with unexpected light. Until we meet again in the realm of ancient stories and whispered legends, rest in the peace that comes from knowing that love, in the end, is always stronger than fear, and that every ending carries within it the seeds of a new beginning.